Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this really important conversation. Our guest speaker is somebody many of you know. Josh Malkin is currently the Senior Advocacy Strategist at the South Carolina ACLU, where he's been since 2021. Josh is deeply committed to advocating for racial and educational equity and protecting the rights of children. He received his Juris Doctorate with honors from Columbia Law School. He has worked as a public defender in New Orleans and at the Mississippi Center for Justice and the New York City Civilian Review Board. And he completed an externship with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. After Josh's presentation, we're going to have plenty of time for questions, I hope. So please put any questions you might have in the chat, and we will try to get to all of them. If you have your video on, I will probably turn it off. And if you happen to turn your mic on, I will probably turn that off. So I encourage you to stay muted throughout the call. And with that, let's get right to it. Josh, welcome.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you all for being here, for making the time tonight. We will get dark very quickly, but please remind me that there's plenty of room for hope and optimism. So if I don't hit on that in my comments, please remind me. In November, a lawyer associated with the Federalist Society, which is a radical legal organization, drafted a book ban regulation for Superintendent Weaver. As originally drafted, it would be the most sweeping book ban the country has seen. It would ban books with any sexual content, and I want to drop how that's defined into the chat for you all. Just give me 1 second. I apologize. And it also is going to let me paste here. My message is too long. Okay. Very quickly, let me read some of it. Any sex, any masturbation, excretory functions, arousal, simulated touching, caressing, or fondling, or other similar physical contact with covered or exposed genitals, and then an act or condition that depicts sex. So really, it's any book with anything close to sexual contact. And then to take it a step further, it would ban any book that violates the FCC's daytime broadcast requirements. So that is essentially profanity. So any book with language that folks deem to be offensive. It's unclear from the original regulations who would be responsible for doing this. My guess is it would fall to local school districts, maybe even schools. This morning, a librarian told me it would take her an entire year to comply with this, that she would essentially need to read every book in her library. And in order to do that without fear of being harassed or have complaints filed against the school, they would shut the library down. It would also allow anyone in the state, parent or not, to file a complaint against an existing book, a book that survives that initial ridiculous test. And if they would appeal it to the state board, and if the state board decided that they were right, they would ban that book for the entire state. Yikes, that's a lot. So we're talking thousands of books. I don't know if folks have been following. In Florida, in Escambia County, there is a list of 1,600 books under review. It includes dictionaries, it includes encyclopedias, and their definition is actually narrower than what's in our proposed regulation. What other terrible things I have to tell you before we get into some optimism? I think that's it. Can we take questions there about the regulation? Those are kind of the main points about the regulation. It's any book with sex, any book with language that folks find offensive. I think, like the autobiography of Frederick Douglass could be banned. It has the N-word. And they really downplayed that when the regulation was first introduced. Folks said, what about the Bible? What about Shakespeare? And the lawyer who drafted them said, no, 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 they wouldn't be affected. But by the language of the regulation, they actually would be. So yeah, I mean, we are looking at the most sweeping book ban regulation the country has seen that I know of. And they are trying, they tried to do it through the State Board of Ed regulation process, which, maybe they thought wouldn't get as much attention as legislation, but it certainly is. So folks definitely know what's going on. Folks have been reaching out to their State Board of Ed representatives to share concerns. But that's where we are with the regulations as currently drafted. So I think it makes sense to stop here and take questions about the drafted regulations, if that's okay with you, Laura. If there are any.
Sorry, I was muted. That's cool. I have a question to kind of kick that off. Is there any sort of age bracketing for this regulation, or is it just banned for everybody from, kindergarten through 12th grade?
Correct. Correct. And I mean, that's what you see with banners, right? They'll file a complaint against a book, Black is a Rainbow Color, which is a beautiful children's book celebrating Black history, celebrating Black joy. And the woman who filed the challenge said the book was inappropriate for K through 12 students because it contained the phrase like Black Lives Matter. And in Lexington too, we've seen multiple challenges about about books dealing with systemic racism, and it's the same thing, right? No one really ever says the challenge they want to remove the book from a certain age segment. These folks say that the books are inappropriate for the entire K through 12 spectrum, which just to me highlights like how disingenuous their concerns really are. If some people wanted to say, this book has sexual content and shouldn't be in elementary school, that's worth having a conversation, absolutely. But the fact that every complaint is K through 12 just highlights that they don't care about nuance, that some children are ready to handle content while others might not be.
Okay, so Evelyn Nocella, does this ban have to go through the SC legislature, or is there another governing body to pass it?
Yes, so it will give February 13th, it will be debated and potentially amended and voted upon by the State Board of Ed. The legislature then has 120 days to deal with it. And if they do nothing, it passes. The legislature can amend it, so they can either veto or accept it. But the legislature does need to sign off on it.
How about sex education in high school?
That is a great question, and I meant to look into this today. There is a provision that references the Sex Education Act, so I need to look into that. So I will get back to you on that. That's a great question.
Any other questions about the regulation itself? There's more to talk about here about the which we could kind of swing into. Maybe Josh is you mentioned to me today that there's an alternative proposal that
Yeah. So here's the good news, right? As opposed to our legislature where no one is an educator, the State Board of Education is, at least half comprised of folks who have dedicated their lives to public education or supporting public education. And I don't think these folks are on board with this regulation. I know for a fact they didn't see it before the lawyer introduced it. It seems like a pretty dysfunctional board that doesn't communicate all that well. And we've had, folks have had a lot, folks across the state have had conversations with their representatives, a lot of whom have said, like, we are not on board with this agenda. So I do anticipate that some amendments will be put up. And I do anticipate there will be lively debate. I don't think this goes through as originally drafted. And just to highlight some of the things, listen, a lot of folks think like, let's leave this to local control, and I can understand that. But certain school boards are terrible, right? It's purely at the discretion of the school board, and we know what's happened to certain school boards, and we know how much money the radical right is investing in school board races. So I, for one, I don't want this to remain in local control, because we could have a situation like Pickens where the book goes through 2 review committees and the board, without even looking at the recommendations, just overrules them. So I actually think local control is a slippery slope here. So I think this presents an opportunity where we're talking to pro-public education folks, where we can actually provide a statewide policy that is protective. And that would include things like limiting the number of challenges that one person can file at a time. In Beaufort, someone filed a list of 97 titles. In Berkeley, it was 93 titles. In Horry, it was 70 titles, one person. It could strengthen the requirement for folks to have discussions with their school administrators about their concerns, because they're not doing that. Where like the idea of civil discourse is just being eroded and eradicated. Height challenges on high school books. I taught high school. Challenges on high school books should have high school students on those review committees, right? Like, to think that our high school students can't engage in thoughtful discourse about the merits of a book and whether it's appropriate for they and their peers is insulting to their intelligence. And also gives them a chance to like participate in civic activities. Books should stay on the shelves while they're under review, right? So in Beaufort, their policy stated that books come off the shelves while under review. They had 97 titles. It took nearly a year to review them all. So those books at the end of the list were essentially banned for that entire year. Students couldn't access them. And then honestly, like the idea of opting out, right? We talk so much about parental rights. These folks have no idea how libraries actually work. There are multiple mechanisms for a parent who is concerned to opt their child out of books. And I think that mechanism, that information needs to be elevated and should be inserted into the statewide policy. And there are librarians who are okay with saying, here's our opt-out list. These are books that contain sexual content. If you want to opt your child out, you can. I, for one, think that's dangerous. I think reading about sexual relationships, reading about sexual violence helps to ensure that our students have healthy sexual and romantic relationships. So parental censorship, this is where I compromise, because there are times when I don't compromise, but this is a compromise I make. Parents have the right to decide what their children read, even when dangerous. So librarians are willing to come up with an opt-out list and mark books that are on the opt-out list and say, hey, the district would publish it and say, do you want to opt your children out of these books? And then librarians have that system. They can opt their children out of all of those books, some of those books, whatever they wanted to do. It's their right as a parent. But that should be elevated, because the idea that like one parent is determining what books are available on a shelf in a school district with 35,000 students it's authoritarian. It's dangerous. It's undemocratic, and it's nonsense, especially in this era of parental rights. So really like educating folks about how librarians already work to have relationships and conversations with parents, and what parents can do to opt their children out of specific titles with which they might be uncomfortable. That's crucial, and librarians are comfortable with it. So I see this as an opportunity to create a policy that protects our educators, protects our students' rights to read, and hopefully puts an end to some of this nonsense.
So I have a question. Who's the final arbiter of what books are on this list? Will it be a statewide list? If somebody in, Columbia, librarian in Columbia has a list, or is that going to be centralized and distributed to every school district, or is each school district going to be able to create its own list? And who does that? The librarian, the school board? can a parent, according to the regulation, can a parent recommend that a book be removed and just have that happen? I mean,
Yeah, so
process.
it may shock you to learn that this policy was sloppily drafted, and it's actually unclear from the language who is responsible for generating this list. My best guess is that I actually don't know because it's supposed to be one list for the entire state. So my best guess is school districts, and having been in front of school districts around the state, a lot of them operate under very justified fear. So, I think what could happen is they'd go to the Moms for Liberty book rating site and they'd say, here are the books we know they're going to attack, and you need to pull all of them.
Yes, it does shock me, Josh.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm very shocked. What
Yeah.
about what about the Bible? There's a lot of sexual content in the Bible.
Yeah, so I will tell you that my colleague actually made that argument in front of the State Board of Ed, saying, he's man grew up with the Bible. He said, here are the passages from the Bible that are clearly implicated by the language of this regulation. And the lawyer who drafted them said, no, they wouldn't. He didn't have an explanation why. He just said, no, they wouldn't. Right. So you bring up the Bible, you bring up Shakespeare, you bring up Oedipus, you bring up Beloved, you bring up The Bluest Eye, you bring up books that are on the AP English exam. And they clearly would be banned under the language of the regulation. And the lawyer had no answer but to say, no, they wouldn't. He couldn't explain it. So yeah, if we're following the language of the regulation, let's be honest, in South Carolina, we don't always follow the language of the law or the regulation. But yeah, the Bible would absolutely be banned.
What are some of the other books that have been brought up that would be definitely on this list that
Yeah, I mean, so The Bluest Eye and Beloved are two of the most frequently assessed books on the AP Lang exam, and they absolutely have passages that satisfy their definition of sexual content. You look at Catcher in the Rye, right? I believe just talking to someone about this yesterday. Holden, I think, has some sort of interaction with a prostitute, right? Like that would likely be banned. To Kill a Mockingbird, there is, the rape allegation, and I think there's also the N-word. So that's banned. So to say that we're only getting rid of these books, that are young adult books that have their own value, but aren't, maybe classics the same way that others are, it's just not true. We would be taking, tens, hundreds of classics off the shelves as well.
so I don't pretend to know that much about teaching, but how would this affect, like, I don't know how much flexibility a teacher has in determining what their class looks like in terms of what books kids read, and as long as they're adhering to the structure of the curricula. But how would that affect teachers who bring their own books in and use their own books sometimes in in classroom discussions and whatever? How would that
Yeah, this question was actually specifically asked of the drafting attorney, and he said that books purchased by teachers would also be implicated in this regulation. They would also be banned. It's also unclear whether, a book club where students bought their own books, they would likely be banned. It's just an absurdly overbroad book ban. Again, 1,600 titles in Escambia, and this language is worse and broader.
Okay, let's see if I got any other questions on this before we kind of move on. So we already talked about who generates the titles. We don't really know. Can be anybody, maybe. Does the regulation have any built-in process for challenging the list?
Challenging the list, no, but it does still afford people to make challenges beyond the list. So again, this is where any taxpayer can file a challenge. Let's say Tom Sawyer didn't make the list, even though I think it would under the FCC piece of the regulation. If someone challenged Tom Sawyer and we are really adhering to the letter of the regulation, someone could appeal that to the state board of education. And if the state board of education said, Tom, you're right, Tom Sawyer is in violation of this regulation, Tom Sawyer would then be banned by for the entire state.
Because one person brought it up.
Exactly. One person who potentially has no children, grandchildren in a school district.
Okay. So let's see. So maybe we should move on to what the process is going to be for this to be approved and what you think we can do. And maybe the best approaches, the best language we can use, that kind of thing, to advocate against this regulation.
Yeah. So your state board of ed rep it's Miss Collier, I think. She represents Greenville and Pickens. She is a rep who so far has been unwilling to meet with constituents. So I don't think further outreach hurts. And then February 13th is the big day. It's when the board will be discussing and likely voting on it and amending, hopefully amending, and then likely voting on the regulation. There is a policy committee meeting at 9 a.m. and then there's a full Board of Ed meeting at 1 p.m. Uh, I anticipate a packed house, and especially since you all, folks from Greenville who are interested in coming, you have a bit of a drive. I would anticipate, I would suggest coming to the 9 a.m. meeting, just so you can, if you want to speak, you can guarantee you have a chance to speak. I'm hopeful that the newly elected chair of the board will let everyone speak at the 1 o'clock, but I can't be sure, especially given how many people might show up. So that 9 a.m. meeting would be a little bit less crowded. And that would be if Miss Collier won't meet with folks, that would be the best time to have your voices heard. Otherwise, I know the League of Women Voters put out an email template today to email the State Board of Ed reps. And I would just uplift some of the points that I've raised, right? We're attacking books on the AP laying exam. These books are not mandatory books. This is a school library where children can have choices. It's an attack on parental rights. Parents largely trust their librarians, largely trust their children to make reading choices. And we know stuff like this just plays into the attack on public educators, right? To me, this is really an endorsement of the idea that librarians are peddling some sort of nefarious agenda. And that's disgusting that the State Board of Education would do that, right? I really would hope that we have a State Board of Ed that could see the book bans, the book challenges happening locally, see the harassment of educators, see the harassment of board members, and say, you know what? We need to stand up and protect the folks that we said we would protect. This is not just about the loud parents. This is about all parents, and this is about all students. And you need to be civil if you have a concern. And what are they doing instead? She's superintendent unilaterally cut ties with the librarians organization without a conversation because they used the word book ban. And then she hired a radical lawyer to draft these ridiculous regulations. So, I hope that, supporting, protecting public ed, public educators, should still be a bipartisan issue. So letting these folks, especially since so many of them we know have dedicated their lives to public ed, that this is really an attack on public education. There are better ways to deal with this. This is a nationally manufactured crisis. I think those are all powerful talking points. And before I forget, I have a packet of materials that I'm hoping Zoom will let me upload if I was tech savvier. All right, Laura, I may need to get this to you, and then if you wouldn't mind, is this it? Let's see. I apologize, y'all. Here we go. So this is the regs as initially drafted. It's also some talking points. So I hope this is like a helpful primer for the initially drafted regs.
Sorry, I was muted again. I will download. I already downloaded that, so anybody who can't download it, I will send it out after the meeting to everybody who had signed up. We had a lot more people who signed up who I think signed up because they wanted to get the recording.
Gotcha.
So we have the regulation is drafted, and then we have some amendments that you mentioned and that the league talked about this morning in their action alert. What's going to be the process if you know for those like amendments? Like, will the state board just consider the reg as it was written and then either pass fail, or will it be amended on the fly through this policy meeting? How do you think that's going to work?
So again, this may not be surprising. The procedures for the State Board of Ed are extremely opaque. Like I don't think anyone really understands them. We do believe that they have a process in place where they can offer amendments to the regulation, and I do think that will happen. Um, yeah, and I'm optimistic again because these are not legislators who are driven by politics. They're really a lot of them are lifelong educators, who have likely either faced harassment themselves or who have a colleague who has faced harassment. Um, and they have an opportunity to stand up and make a statement in protecting public educators and public education.
And then following the vote, it goes to the state legislature for a vote.
It does. It does. It does. And they don't need to act. Let me just pull this up 1 sec. It's a 120-day review period. If they do nothing, it's approved. If they do nothing, it is automatically approved. And it will need to go to the full education committee after 60 days. But if the committee doesn't do anything with it, then it just automatically gets codified.
So the legislators can avoid actually putting their names on this nonsense and just ignore it, and it will just become law
Correct.
or regulation, not law. But
Yes.
and then anytime somebody in Charleston adds a book to the list, everybody in the entire state will have that book pulled out of their school library or classroom or whatever.
Right. So the whoever is making the list, and I think this would be educators. Educators or school boards would make the initial list. Where they would go to make the list is unclear because, if we're going to do this in good faith, if we're going to adhere to this ridiculous regulation in good faith, it requires like really reading or skimming every single book in the library, right? Like obviously librarians would know, okay, this book has sex, this book has profanity, but for the most part, there are thousands of books in the library. They would need to sit down and read or skim the books. So it would take a year. But then if a parent or taxpayer thinks there's a book that should be challenged that's not on the list, right, then they can challenge that. And if they don't like the decision their local board makes, they can appeal directly to the State Board of Ed, who would have the authority to ban it for the burn it, Freudian slip, to ban it for the entire state. And knowing how many books are on the Moms for Liberty rating system, right? Like they are continuing to work, but there are thousands of books they have targeted as being inappropriate, age inappropriate.
And the county boards of ed have had no say in this. Is that accurate?
I mean, I was at that first meeting when it was introduced. I've talked to some State Board of Ed members. They did not see this until that meeting. Or they had access. I guess we all had access to it a few days before that meeting. But this was not, as far as I know, as far as I can tell, this was not circulated to the board. This does not seem like it's a fully functional board, but there's like open and frequent communication. So yeah, I think this to me is Superintendent Weaver leaning into her radical Moms for Liberty agenda, and really not surprisingly doing so in a very thoughtless way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so any questions for Josh that we haven't already answered? I promised him that I wouldn't make him sit here for an entire hour if we had gotten through everybody's questions, but we have plenty of time. If anyone has a question, put it in the chat and we'll get to it. Stephanie, you want me to unmute you? Where'd you go?
And just to briefly address Mary's point, yes, every county is officially represented on the State Board of Ed. I don't believe any of those board members were involved in the drafting process or saw this regulation before it was available to the public. But yes, every county is officially represented by a member of the State Board of Ed.
Josh, you talked about an event on February 13th. What is that event, and is that something we can be a part of?
Yeah, it is the monthly State Board of Education meeting. The
Okay.
policy subcommittee meets at 9. The full Board of Ed meets at 1. If you are coming for the full Board of Ed meeting, I recommend getting there early just because parking is tricky and we're hoping there's a good turnout. So in order to get a seat, I recommend getting there a little bit earlier. But yeah, if Ms. Collier is unwilling to meet constituents, that would be the time to make your voices be heard. In addition to sending your own emails or filling out the League of Women Voters template, or what have you.
Laura, can you send something out on that about that date to see?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Is there a requirement, Josh, in terms of when do you have to file a request to speak to that policy meeting or?
Yeah, and again, their processes could use some cleaning up. What it was last time was the security guard kind of kept track of who got there first, and then he put the lists out maybe half an hour before the full State Board of Ed meeting, and folks signed up according to who got there first. Yeah, you can't do it in person. And last month it was really nice and like democratic. When the weather was bad, they let folks send in comments remotely. But I think that was a one-time deal, so that only folks who are in person will be able to have their comments heard at the February 13th meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And I see Eugenia, yes, I believe in real time, if not in real time shortly after, but I believe in real time.
So Linda Hardman is asking if everything goes through, and this becomes the statewide regulation, what strategies can we do to help the situation?
I will tell you, Linda, that I am the opposite of optimistic generally. I am as optimistic as I get that this regulation does not go through as originally drafted. I think even really conservative folks realize that this is an absurdly drafted regulation, and will not go for it. If it were to, I think we have some lawyers who would look at it and file a lawsuit. We are seeing, book ban bills get struck down in courts. The Fifth Circuit, which, is the Texas circuit and is doing a lot of unhinged things recently. They recently struck down a book ban bill. Iowa struck down a book ban bill. Florida struck, so I hope we don't get to that. I hope we can do this with advocacy and reason and civil discourse. But I imagine if it were to go through as originally drafted, we'd have some lawyers taking a look at it.
Do you think our Supreme Court might make of something like that? How would you see your odds there?
At the United States Supreme Court?
No, at the South Carolina Supreme Court.
I mean, you're having Trump appointees say, why is one person controlling what's available to everyone? I just think this is a step too far for the overwhelming majority of Americans. I know the South Carolina Supreme Court less. I and this is me speculating, if a lawsuit were filed, it'd be filed in federal court on First Amendment, maybe equal protection claims, so we could file in federal court, if lawyers thought that was the better move. But I mean, I don't really, if the Fifth Circuit is saying that this is a step too far, I just can't imagine there are many courts out there anywhere who are going to say, yeah, it's acceptable that we pull thousands of books off of library shelves across the state.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's moderately encouraging, but of course you don't want it to go this far.
Yeah, and here's been an optimism because I know we all of us likely get into the mindset of this is South Carolina and what can we really do? Advocacy matters. Advocacy has been effective in South Carolina, and I know that the idea that like losing slower is winning is harder to swallow. But I want folks to know, especially in the upstate where y'all have ridiculously hard fights, the advocacy matters and is having an impact. We don't have the overwhelming majority of the MAGA agenda in South Carolina, and that's thanks to advocacy. So is it discouraging? Yes. Is it disgusting to be in the room so many of the times? Absolutely. A Greenville Library Board meeting is a terrible place to be. But I want you all to know I've watched this play out across the state. I've watched folks advocate locally and make change. I've watched folks advocate at state level and make change. So please, as terrible as it feels, as easy as it is to say this is South Carolina and this is just the natural course of action, please know that's not. So many of these terrible things are not happening in South Carolina because amazing people like you all are paying attention and advocating.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good to hear. And of course, we gotta fight. We can't just like pull our shells over our heads and you know. So so the way I see it, then we should try to
Yes.
get a meeting with the school board rep Collier, Miss Collier, you mentioned. We can do that. Then women can try to get a meeting with her. Sounds like that won't happen, but at least we can say we tried. And I have the document that you provided. If there's anything else you want to share with our group, send it to me and I will push it out in an email the next day or two with the recording link.
Okay.
And we'll write the letters, we'll make the phone calls. Maybe we'll organize a little letter writing party or something to
Awesome.
kind of make it something we do together. But we'll get the word out and hope that you and your other advocates are able to really, if we can pack the room, that might be helpful. Let's see here. So our K-4 elementary age books on diversity and families also banned.
Yeah. So, I mean, and this is what's so, I mean, it's all upsetting, but under the language of the regulation, they shouldn't be, right? If there's no sexual content, if there's no profanity, there's no reason for those books to be banned. But what we've seen in places like Greenville is folks call gay couples pornography, right? So I think although it has nothing to do with the language of the regulation, I think you would see those challenges. And they're disgusting and they're prejudiced and they're awful. And hopefully the school board and the state board would be able to say that. But the fact that people even bring those challenges is harmful. So yeah, as bad as the written word of the regulation is, and again, worst in the country, worst in the country. I think the animus behind book bans is even worse. So books like this, about, a children's book with two moms or two dads, or, a children's book about gender identity, would likely be challenged.
Is there anything in the regulation that would focus on racial issues, slavery, depictions of slavery, things of that nature?
So my fear is that the FCC piece, which is you can't have profane content, I think that books with black characters that have profanity would be disproportionately targeted. And I think books with the N-word would be disproportionately targeted. So you're talking about the autobiography of Malcolm X, you're talking about the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. There are some book banners who really, I think, legitimately are focused on sexual content. But as we know in Greenville, there are also book banners who are just driven by prejudice. So if they see an opportunity in the regulation, or they just want to, they will absolutely target books with racial content on whatever grounds they like, whether in the regulation or not.
So if a high schooler, if a kindergartner can't read the autobiography of Malcolm X, neither can a senior in high school.
I want to double check that, but I'm pretty sure it is a K through 12 ban, correct?
Okay. Any other questions, you guys? So I tell you what, if you guys have any questions after the fact and you send them to me, I will send them on to Josh. And if he has a free moment in his lackadaisical days, I'm sure he'll get back to me. But we'll try to get you any information that you need, and I will be in touch with everybody about next steps and giving you the information you need, at least to advocate, on your own with your own elected officials and whatever. What really concerns me is the idea that they can just ignore it and have it become the regulation. Because that seems to me like something they would do to avoid like having to put their name on it, and they could just throw up their hands and say, well, I didn't vote for it.
Right.
That scares me.
Right.
So I want to thank Josh very much for your time tonight. It's always
Pleasure
a
as
pleasure
always.
to hear you tell us how lovely things are. So we haven't figured that out. And thank you everybody for coming. And a couple of you may have had a few blips with hanging into the conversation. Don't worry, I'm going to I'll have a recording, which everybody will get a link to within about a day or two. So thank you, everybody. And
Thanks,
Thanks.
Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank
Thanks,
you all.
Josh.
Look
Thanks.
forward to
Thanks, Laura.
hopefully seeing some of
Okay.
you on Saturday.